I'm recording. Hey guys, great to see the enthusiasm, and I'm pretty enthusiastic for today as well. We'll be talking about a concept and the benefits and so forth of it. That'll be pretty unique to what I understand about the world and so forth. So let's pretty much get started. I have fairly good slides for this one. I have 3 of them, but they're pretty good. Okay, at least for good in the sense of a bit of a structure and for my structure for myself, I believe. Okay, so there's a number of things on here, but I think I might, we'll see. I usually get this, usually say this and then it doesn't end up happening exactly, but I might kind of go through overview of the slides and then go back through them. But on the other slides, let me just take a quick look at them here. This kind of reminds us of some of the central ideas and how the idea we'll talk about of law of implication in the definitive series on the second slide, and then we'll show how the idea today is critical for our central ideas. And the idea today will be understanding, realizing how our mind, we could say our mind does it or it's presented for us in our mind, whatever, but one way or the other, we as conscious beings, as we experience our experience, we're presented with what will end up being, when we understand properly, will be metaphors and representations, but we don't think of them that way. We experience them and think of them as reality, and typically as truth, not always as truth, but often if our mind presents, what our mind will do is it'll present, the next thing I wrote here is map versus accurate, map versus territory. I'll jump right into that mental image. This is not a perfect example or metaphor of what I'm talking about, but it contains some distinctions that'll be very helpful. So it's very good to have in our mind. So if we're looking at a map, if we have possession of a map, then there's 2 different issues. One is the accuracy of the map, and there's almost a third, which is you can have a map that's accurate, but it lacks certain details, right, that it could otherwise have, of course, right? Every map is going to potentially be able to have potentially included even more stuff, right, in the map. But then furthermore, the map itself is not like a map of New York City is not New York City. It's a map of New York City. The map can be very useful. We can intelligibly talk about the map being accurate, but even a perfectly accurate map still would not be New York City. And as a side note, it could also contain more details, probably, that are also correct, right? Theoretically. So to talk about whether a map is accurate, similar to talking about whether a metaphor is accurate or a representation of is accurate, just like if you have ambassadors from another country, even if they're telling the truth about their country, they're still not the country itself, right? They're not China if they're ambassadors from China. Even if they can speak for the authorities in China, both accurately and in terms of, power or policy, right? They're still not the country itself. To just sort of, again, continue to kind of go through some of this here, or wait, it's in the bottom here. So at the bottom of this first slide, one of the serious issues or bottlenecks that we are dealing with as people, which normally people don't realize the bottleneck exists and never overcome the bottleneck, so their whole life is constrained by this bottleneck, okay? Which is regarded pretty much as a truth in psychology, that this is how people are, but it's actually a bottleneck that doesn't have to be. And that is that, so there was originally an idea around, it might have been Freud, it might have been around the time of Freud and Carl Jung and so forth. I believe it was Carl Jung, but anyway, but there's this idea of like a horse and a rider, ego and id, and where there's like, you know, our subconscious mind or whatever, and then there's the conscious mind, and you're like a rider directing the horse, right? Like you consciously, probably ego, right, is probably where I'm not like a huge student of like, I think it's probably 19th century maybe, psychology, but we all have some sense of it, right? And one thing that has very much kind of seeped into culture, even in the metaphor itself, but the like the theory of mind, and whether or not it might have been in culture for thousands of years, and that was just one example of it. But this idea that we basically, people, that we and other people ultimately can and should control their minds, and are like in control, like a rider on a horse, and they're still the horse, but the rider sort of controls the horse, even if the horse can have its own mind, go a little crazy sometimes, and so forth. So maybe through human history, maybe intuitively, you know, kind of always, there was some sense of this. And we certainly do this to other people where we're like, well, you shouldn't do that. You should have controlled yourself, right? You should have done this, that, or the other thing, where you shouldn't have responded that way, right? It kind of implies that we have this theory of mind where people do control kind of the outer frame, or they're, you know, they're the rider that's ultimately like in control of the horse, or should be in control of the horse. A little bit like how we might even think of an owner and a dog, right? How we tend to think that, or people, parents and children. This is often unfair, right? But we'll think, you know, well, you need to control your dog, you need to control your kids. If they're doing certain things, then you know, it's your fault. There's some truth to that. There's some not. I'm just using that as an example of what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to really comment on that one way or the other. But it's been discovered fairly lately, within the last, I think, few decades, where it's accepted for good reason and kind of proven out time in various ways. And I've given you some examples of that. And different times I give you, you know, a set of books that talk about this sort of thing. Book called Subliminal, a book called Social. There's a book called How We Know What Isn't True. There's a book called Cognitive Illusions, I believe, Inevitable Illusions. And then there's Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and so forth. But one idea that's been very important, and it's a big paradigm shift, is that it's more like people are a fairly weak rider on like an elephant, right? And the elephant being the subconscious mind that's really controls so much. And it really only it presents people with reasons why they do things that are like a story that the mind constructs that's not really true. You can do experiments such as showing people, I think it's in one example, like 4 identical pieces of cloth, and asking, or something like that, and asking people which one they prefer. And I'm sorry, I'm a little, when I quote experiments, it'd probably be better if I had my facts a little straight. But I know the bottom line. The bottom line is that I believe it was the most, either the first or the most recent one people preferred, that they looked at in order, and that was the only possible difference. But then when they were asked why, they would come up with other reasons why they preferred one or the other. And when asked if it could be because it was the most recent one they looked at or something, then they would view that as absurd. In another kind of somewhat spooky example, when people come up for parole, right, about 1/3 of people, I think, are given parole, about 2/3 are denied, right, each time it comes up, as I understand, according to this that I read. This is an example. It's in Thinking Fast and Slow. I don't have the page off the top of my head. But right after they eat, then judges are a lot more likely to grant people parole, like they're in kind of a better frame of mind, right? And then as they kind of get more tired and cranky, or as in the morning, as it becomes more closer to lunchtime, but it's not lunchtime yet, they'll tend to deny more applications. So that's a major factor, right? It's almost like a 2-to-1 type of weight, you know, like you have like almost half the chance of getting granted parole based on the time of day relative to their meal and when they start in the morning, that your case, or I don't know if it's the person's there or if it's just they're looking at a sheet or whatever, but if you're when your case comes up before the judge. So those are examples of the elephant, really, like why there's more of a mental image or an idea metaphor of an elephant with a kind of a weak rider, is where so much is under the control kind of subconscious framing and how things kind of feel beyond the processing that we're aware of, beyond what people think of as their conscious mind and conscious decisions. And that's a problem, right? It's a bottleneck. Bottleneck, again, in my kind of expansive use of the word bottleneck, where it's more than just the constraint, the part of the machine that's making less widgets, but it's whatever it is that is getting in the way of like goodness, right? And what we truly would want, right? Ideally, for example, given the parole system, I'm not really going to get into that in government right this moment, but given that system of giving people parole, where they basically get out of jail, right, after a certain amount of time, and then go into a kind of limbo type of, parole system where they're out, but they have a parole officer. Given that system, we would obviously want the judges to be judging based on something other than when they had their most recent meal, right? That's an example of my general idea of bottleneck, right? That's obviously a problem or a bottleneck that would want to be broken. So if the judges are doing that, we're doing it, right? And Daniel Kahneman himself, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about when he grades papers, and as he was starting to understand this stuff, he did some experiments with himself, and he saw how if there was like 3 essays on a test, then based on how well a student did on the first essay, it would greatly influence the grade they got in the next of like 3 essays that were all part of a test, right? So because Daniel Kahneman, just like any professor, right, presumably, would subconsciously, like the elephant would, his subconscious mind would control him and make him feel like, oh, the next essay, if it seemed like it wasn't so good, they give him much more the benefit of the doubt. If the first essay had been good. If the first essay had been bad, then you look with a more critical eye on the next one, and it made a significant difference, he noticed. And when he randomized things by making it so he couldn't see like whose name went with what essay, right? So when he was looking at someone's second essay, he didn't know what their first was graded. Then it totally played havoc with the grades. They were like all over the place, like in the first essay, second, third. So we think someone was had a good grasp of the material, and then on the same test with the second essay question, and what the person wrote for it, they would do a much worse job. And he felt it bothered him. Like it didn't bother, but he admits this. Like he noticed that it emotionally bothered him. Like he felt worse about himself when he was doing things right, because his grading for a person wouldn't fit a nice tight story, right? A nice pat story about whether they were a good student or bad student, at least in his class. Whereas his mind could construct a nice coherent story where a good student, but judged by kind of the first essay, the halo effect, right? Where the second essay then would be judged in a more positive light, and the grades would be much more coherent that way. And under that illusion, Daniel Kahneman noticed that he felt better about himself as a professor. But again, he admits and sees and experimented with all this, so to his benefit, right? But he admits how he feels, and I do kind of similar things in myself. Not that same experiment. I didn't discover that, he did, and he's done a lot of work of things that I myself had not and would not have discovered with the science he's done and the thinking he's done. But I do kind of a similar thing where I can see how I feel, about things and notice oddities, and I've obviously done a lot of that. I have more of a kind of a philosophical approach. I'll get more of my psychology from people doing the science and learning from them, and I kind of blend the knowledge from that in with my kind of philosophical approach, where I kind of deal with data that I get from other people but from my own experience too. And when I say my own experience, I mean that kind of in a kind of a deeper way, like kind of looking at my own mind, not just trying stuff in the physical world. Anyhow, so what we'll be talking about today is, and this idea here on the top of this slide, with the metaphors and representations being presented as truth and reality. The map being presented both as accurate and as the territory. that going on pervasively without us realizing it, except that now we can realize it, right? But we'll be pretty unique in really realizing it to its full extent, right? There'll be, in rare cases, people discover a bit of this, right? And the whole idea of neurolinguistic programming, that whole branch of philosophy started by Richard Bandler and John Grinder. I believe it's Bandler and Grinder. With their structure of magic, I believe, was their kind of either their doctoral dissertations or soon after that, and that kind of started things. That's kind of difficult reading, but then other people took off on it. Ross Jeffries in the pickup world, Tony Robbins, right, in the success world, and several others. A number of the things that came out of that I find aren't that useful in practice, like trying to put the phrase like by now you can make a decision on whether you want this product, right? But then the idea is that BY and then NOW is also sounds to the mind like you buy now, like the command buy now, and that's supposed to kind of stick in someone's mind and kind of anchor or frame things to make them more likely to buy. I don't find that stuff particularly useful or effective. However, there is something else about neurolinguistic programming that is quite useful, and that relates to what we're talking about today. And you literally use the phrase, the map is not the territory. And so that's where I kind of pulled that from. And so they've taken it a certain way, a certain length, but they're nowhere near with the kind of the philosophy understanding, and that they just don't have a lot of the building blocks that I happen to have through my other endeavors with philosophy and such. So they couldn't realize really what we're talking about today because they don't have the basis. But there's a lot with neurolinguistic programming in that field of psychology, and what Bandler and Grinder worked on, and then what people that some of their disciples worked on. That is a lot of the other building blocks that are big for a law of implication that helped me get to where I am, and a number of things will be familiar and so forth, and useful kind of background or practical stuff and such. All right, so we're talking about the elephant. I also, of course, have talked about the outer frames with Othello, right? If you control the corners and the outer frames, then you kind of win. And that relates very much to this idea of the elephant, where people live lives that they're constrained subconsciously, and they have no sense of the constraint. What we'll talk about today will make it possible for you to not live a life where you're kind of controlled by the subconscious elephant, but this webinar won't get rid of the elephant, but it'll give you the tools and the potential ability to, it's not about getting rid of the elephant, but where you kind of get outside of the elephant, right? So it's not, you still can get to the outer frames yourself. Outer frame type ideas are this itself right here, about this idea of metaphors and reality, the idea of your consciousness field, the idea of you as a being, basically identity, your own identity. If you get that straight, then that's an example of like controlling one of the corners of the Othello board, right? Next webinar, I think I'll get straight to talking about how to know that God exists, which is really mostly based on understanding three concepts properly, which is the concept of cause, the concept of goodness, and the concept of infinite or infinity. If we kind of get those right, and then kind of look at the implication of that, then we'll understand that God exists and the nature of God pretty decently. And that might even wrap up the definitive series in a certain sense, that I might do a few like bonus sort of videos. Maybe I'll just kind of go directly after talking about relationships for a webinar and about success for a webinar, and then see. And then I might think of some other things to kind of directly teach about and kind of add those on. We'll see. So understanding about God and like cause is part of the corners of the Othello board, so to speak. When you kind of can have these basic ideas, foundational ideas right, then it's not that the elephant disappears, but again, the elephant is inside of the frame that you're outside of, and then it's less of an elephant at that point. You still want to have a healthy respect, both a very genuine appreciation for what your mind and your subconscious mind does and how much it takes care of for you and how necessary that is. Like having something as powerful as an elephant, working for you is great, right? You just don't want it like running the business, right? Or the circus or the plantation or the farm or whatever our metaphor might be. So I'm sort of covering both this concept, or starting to, while simultaneously trying to do my best to show where we're going with it and why it's important and where we're going with it. Let me just also skip to this last slide and then I'll go back. I did a fair amount of mental work this week on what are some applications. Sometimes I run into problems with these kind of deepest ideas, like we talk about identity, for example. Then it's like, well, how does this help me? Well, again, it's like, how does controlling one of the corners or all the corners of the Othello board help me? If I'm handcuffed, how does taking off handcuffs help me with the Olympics, or playing any sport or whatever, right? It's a little bit of an absurd. Of course, from one perspective, it's a totally fine question to ask, and I'm not belittling it. In another sense, when we kind of get the idea of foundationalism and how much it matters to break critical bottlenecks, to take the handcuffs off, to have our tools, whatever kind of metaphor we want to use. These are all reasonable metaphors, right? How does having our tools not be screwed up and broken and incomplete help us build a house, right, or fix something? How does not having handcuffs help us to play a sport? But yet, I wanted to go beyond that rather than just kind of berating people for theoretically asking the question of, well, what's the benefit of this? How do we use it? A few things that came to mind in addition to everything, right? So one answer is, how does this help us, is with everything. It's just that when you control a corner of the Othello board, you don't like instantly win the game. It's just over time, it's an unstoppable advantage used properly. And that's how a lot of the stuff I'm teaching, especially foundational stuff, is used properly over time. It's like you're going to Vegas with a 60% chance of winning every bet rather than a 48, 45, whatever it is, percent chance, right? Where the house over time always wins. If you're going through life, all of a sudden, metaphorically, you are the house instead of betting against the house, right? We can come up with whatever percentages in our mental image we want, 60%, 53%, whatever. If you go all in on a 50%, 53% chance of winning, then you could still get taken out, right? Go bust. But if you use that properly, take your time, you're not in a rush, right? Because we can understand it's another one of the very basic frames, whether it's fully foundational or not. I won't, speculate on this a second, but understanding not to struggle, not to rush, but instead to look at progress and winning differently than that is critical. And it goes along with this idea that we have this unstoppable, inevitable advantage to winning. And we can couple that with an understanding of we want everyone to win. So it's not really about defeating other people, but instead we can use our advantage of winning to get ourselves stable and where we're not like worried about our survival or whatever, our desperation. So we're not desperate, and then we work towards everybody winning. Maybe first the people closest to winning in a useful way, or or the people just closest to us, right? And so forth, and go from there. Or not, whatever's on our heart. Certainly you can go to people that in one sense are far from you and help them as well because they're in need or whatever. I fully support that, of course, just, you know, whatever is pretty clearly correct or at least clearly reasonable. All right, so on this slide here, what's interesting is something I've alluded to, but as I worked on it, it's so weirdly true. I'm adding laziness in here. We can start with fear. It's interesting to note something that I've never really seen realized somewhere else. Maybe someone has, but fear. You know, we'll hear like, obviously we'll hear like you have to face your fear, or else it'll kind of master you, or you have to, you know, overcome your fear, or obviously there's the famous, you know, nothing to fear but fear itself, or we can't let fear, you know, control us. And then there's also the idea, though, that people say, well, of course, some fear can be good. There's times when it's legitimate to be afraid. Well, this understanding that I have here is, I think, more accurate and really gets to, again, it gets our kind of metaphor representation of fear more accurate and therefore more useful. Really, fear, what we identify as fear when we look at it, fear as a concept almost disappears and dissolves. It's just kind of more like something we seem to observe. And it really becomes a question of a cost-benefit calculation carried on, whether it's fully subconsciously, partly subconsciously, mostly consciously, whatever, one way or the other, it's being carried out by your mind with any amount of participation by you. And it's a cost-benefit calculation if you think about it, where kind of moving toward the object of your fear in some way isn't worth the cost. We might feel that as kind of a pain, right? Or again, that a feeling of an emotion of fear. But if we think it through, it's basically a cost-benefit calculation that's then kind of being presented to us as a feeling of fear. As we understand that, then the answer is not just to deny that you're afraid or to step forward anyway, but the answer would be to if you suspect that something's off, and the very frame or whatever causes you to suspect, we would want that to be more accurate, right? Like our red flags that come up in our mind of like, whoa, I want to stop and think about this, that the meta system of having those signals to stop and think, having those be more accurate and come up when you want them to, and not come up when they might be a false flag, ideally. But then, so there's the meta idea of the flag coming up in the first place, and then if and when the flag comes up, wait a second, maybe this fear isn't useful, then the answer would be to walk your mind through a more accurate cost-benefit calculation. And then a constant thing that comes up is, as we do law of implication and as we try to think about our mind and success and stuff, is the second question of, okay, I feel like I've changed my cost-benefit calculation, but then how do I feel it, right? And the answer to how to feel things is, first of all, it can patience and not rushing might be part of it, and so it might end up taking some time. Certainly, you can channel your kind of conscious overriding of what you're doing, like your effort, your conscious effort, which is a limited resource each day in essence. But you can kind of channel it into getting started, things that'll, you know, take the first step. We can also work on our representations, right? So part of how to change how we feel about something, right? Which it'll often partly change from thinking things through and kind of changing how we intellectually look at something. But then we might often feel like, well, I've concluded this intellectually, but I still want to feel it more in an integrated way. That's actually when neurolinguistic programming can help, or an idea from it can help. But then that relates back to what we're doing today is this idea is going to crack open. It's a simple idea, so I'm talking about the idea, and then the idea itself is weirdly simple. But it'll be kind of not used if it has to be kind of packaged, is what I'm doing in this webinar. The idea itself, I don't mean to make it sound overly melodramatic or difficult. It's just going to be kind of dismissed by our minds if we don't talk about it perhaps in the way that I am. Not that I for sure know the perfect way to do this webinar, but at least this is my best sense of it. So an application of neurolinguistic programming is that we can play with the representations that our mind makes. And they kind of help us, their idea is to think of it as like a map rather than the territory, which what they need, and what we're doing even better here, is something that starts to form a crack in this all-powerful sense that what we experience is true and real, such that if we start to mess with our representations, then we're fooling ourselves. Right? So a major bottleneck that imprisons you is, first of all, just straight up what I've been saying, what I wrote here on this first line about they're presented as truth and reality. But then it's manifested in a feeling like you're fooling yourself. So let's say someone's studying for a test, they don't feel like they want to study very much. And then you present them with the idea that, okay, well, you can change your representation. Like you can picture something as simple as you are studying for the test in the future, right? Anything you picture, like if you're picturing studying for the test, you're picturing studying for the test in the future, even if it's in a few minutes from now. So you picture it, and then you imagine that you like it, that you're enjoying it. You're like, wow, this is actually nicer than I thought. I'm enjoying it more than I thought. And then you can keep going and think about doing well on the test and being like, wow, that was because I studied and I enjoyed studying and it went well. And then go further and think about how you might celebrate or the benefits, or maybe you're calling up your mom and telling her how you aced the test. Maybe telling your friends, but that could be a mixed bag, right? You may or may not want to tell your friends how you aced the test. If they're not in the class, then more likely that works out well. If they're in the class, then you have to worry about, how they're going to feel, how they did on the test. But whatever works for you is you start to add things and or subtract things or put a frame around. Another example of putting a frame around something is you can take something that you're either scared of or even grieving about, even someone's death. This is a good example of how someone could quickly feel like they're fooling themselves, or a traumatic event like abuse. So let's say somebody has experienced abuse in the past, and you play kind of a mental movie of experiencing that abuse and having kind of funny, maybe playing it backwards, and then there's funny music playing with it. Now, immediately, it can often be the reaction of people to be like, well, no, that's terrible. Like the person themselves, right, that was abused, or even someone thinking about it theoretically, being like, that's terrible. You shouldn't minimize abuse. And then they might feel like they're fooling themselves, or worse, that they're somehow condoning or minimizing how wrong it was and such, right? So that bottleneck, something that's actually effective in a certain, for a moment, let's put aside, we can come back to it, but let's put aside the question, all the objections to whether or not we should mess with someone's memory of abuse, right? To take the edge off of the hurt. Or even me with jury duty, or other times when authority extorted or enslaved me, right? When I was nearly put in jail by a judge. If that is causing me any kind of trauma or whatever, then I could play this scene kind of backwards with funny music. I could imagine even all the policemen kind of like dancing around kind of in a funny way, and just kind of totally scratch the record, as Tony Robbins puts it, mess with the representation. And doing that, even the first time, but also repetitively, actually affects your mind's representation and the feelings associated with it. However, so in a vacuum, it actually works to some degree, and to a significant degree. However, there's then the block that it shouldn't be done in some cases, like with the abuse, or a person dies, right? And the grieving of it, right? You can do the same thing. But there's that sense that it shouldn't be done, and or that because it is bad, like it's real. See, the is like it's truth, it's reality. That memory is presented as truth and reality. And someone could further object and say, well, isn't it true that that abuse was bad, and isn't that memory the reality? Well, sorry, little traffic jam of multiple answers came to mind. It's not that I have no answers, that I have like multiple thoughts at once. First of all, memories are way different than they're constructed by the mind, and they can be way different than what actually happened. However, in the case of abuse, I'm certainly not accusing someone that was actually abused, which has happened, bazillions of times with people. It's happened to many people, and some of them multiple times or many times. For real, and nothing I'm saying is minimizing any form of abuse in any way. At the same time, what we can do is, it's still true that memories are constructed. And so to some degree, the memory is not the reality. The reality could have been way worse, by the way, right? Like the memory is probably not as bad even as the reality. But there's lots of true things in the world. And in terms of what our feelings, and like what we're trying to do is create a good future, right? Obviously, like we want to have both success, like we want to achieve certain results, break certain bottlenecks on the way to goodness, right? We want everyone to experience nothing but goodness, including ourselves, right? Ideally. And whether that's possible to get perfect or not is not relevant, as long as there's plenty of progress to be made. Where it doesn't matter, wait, can things be perfect? Well, they can certainly be way better than they are, so let's start with that. Right? Let's start with what we know. Start by eliminating the mistakes that can be clearly identified, and then we'll go from there. Right? Always with success, you're starting with what you know and going from there. So therefore, the only usefulness of a memory, and or these kind of blend together in what they are, but associations, learning, layers of knowledge and experience, all that stuff, right, from the past that's carried forward. The only purpose of it is to make the future better. Right now, our mind on its own, the elephant won't tell us that. That's not how people tend to realize in a consistent way. People might affirm that at various times, that statement I made, but they don't live that way in a consistent manner, right? There's all sorts of other things the mind gets sidetracked on, except for keeping focused on, there's really only one thing we're trying to get to, which is maximum goodness, right, for ourselves and everyone else. Goodness being in our direct experience as a conscious being, not the twisted form of goodness, which is just like getting what our mind thinks it wants right now. It may work out nicely for your mind to get what it wants, but that's not the same as goodness. It may overlap, but it's not the root of goodness. It's not the outer frame. It's not how we kind of orient ourselves to remind ourselves what goodness actually is. So I'm using this idea of abuse as an example, and then for us to see how. So I'm reorienting ourselves to a basic frame. One of the corners, there might be more than 4 corners, but yeah, but absolutely foundational idea is that the only reason we do anything, make any decision, the only thing that we're going for in life, it's all oriented around one goal, which is maximum goodness. And then there's just bottlenecks along that. So the only use of any past experience, learning, memories, etc., mental associations, representations, the only use of everything in our current mind in that way, right, in terms of that stuff, is to make the future better. Period. So to the extent to which we cannot feel and conclude anything that will, like, to the extent that abuse is holding somebody back. And part of the great tragedy of abuse is that it has a lasting effect, right? Again, if we keep thinking it through, the whole, that's why child molestation, other types of abuse that can happen to adults can be way worse than just the pain of that one experience, right? The actual abuse might be about the same as some other things we might experience that aren't abuse, but they just kind of a crappy thing that happened to us that's kind of no one's fault, or or we get injured and we have to have it treated, and the injury plus the treatment is difficult, right? But the trauma of a person like intentionally violating us in that way can carry forward in various ways, or it can interfere with someone's natural, healthy sense of sexuality, right? If it's related to sexual abuse. I think this happens with learning, where there's a natural tendency and enjoyment and kind of a gravitation towards learning that people have, and that is treated in essence in an abusive way, where people are kind of violated in a way that's called learning, right? Just like very similar in my understanding, and in an effect to violating someone in a way that's associated kind of naturally with sexuality, right? If you're violating someone in a way that's associated with learning, you're calling it learning, right, and so forth, but you're forcing it on somebody in a kind of an unnatural way, then you can get the same effective abuse where their relationship with learning that people have goes from healthy to unhealthy. Just like someone can have an unhealthy relationship with stuff related to sexuality based on abuse. Doesn't happen in every case that someone has difficulties with sexuality as an adult because they're abused, right? However, if there's an obvious correlation, there's an obvious contribution to it. Same thing with learning abuse. It won't always lead to somebody having issues of learning, but again, it's kind of predictable, or it's a contributing factor that then might cause it. Just like something might tend to cause poverty, it doesn't mean that every single person that experiences that thing that tends to cause poverty ends up having experiencing poverty later, or living in poverty throughout their life. Anyway, that last point is relevant and useful to life, but a little bit of a tangent. With the main thread had to do with if it's the case that trauma, that something about abuse is going to negatively impact somebody later, either in an ongoing way or later in their life, or immediately right after the abuse and then ongoing throughout their life, then obviously we don't want that, right? So that we want to eliminate that. Eliminating the bad after effects does not need to be one and the same as minimizing, as something, as whatever it is that we shouldn't do, right? Obviously, we should minimize the negative effects on the victim. And so there might even be a temporary time and place to sort of emotionally experience how bad the abuse is if you're trying to communicate it to somebody who just doesn't think it's so bad somehow, right? That happens. Anything that's normal in a culture, people might not think it's so bad. Or to have yourself be believed, right? So there might be moments, just like there might be times, I don't know this for sure, but there might be times when anger is useful for communicating temporarily something. However, outside of the times when you need it for communication, when you need to kind of, and then you can honestly and accurately get into that state of kind of trauma. And again, it might have a time and a place for communicating it to help prevent it in the future, right? Separate from that, you don't need to like experience it in ways that are just going to be hurtful. So having those distinctions, and then that's when this neurolinguistic programming idea can come up. The reason why I talk about all of this with a neurolinguistic programming example and how you can mess with frames and play funny music, play it backwards, add things, is because that's an example of the type of thing that you can't do if you're blocked, right? If you feel like, if there's a deeper frame where you're like, no, this is real, this is what it is. So then, okay, so what do I mean by real? What do you mean, David? Like, you need to explain that more, right? So let me just go straight now to explaining this kind of the central idea here. Now that I've talked a bit about like why and where we're going, or places it can go, things that can help you with fear, helplessness. This can do wonders for helplessness, and helplessness is at the root of virtually every negative emotion and disempowering emotion. You can try, like if you feel disempowered or particularly angry about something. I felt this way, last year or two in a couple, various times, but then I'm at least aware, oh, I can only be feeling this way if I feel helpless. And helplessness is, I know I'm on one more sort of tangent here for a second. I'll get back to the main point in a moment. Helplessness has to be, can only exist as part of a constricted time frame. A calculation of helplessness I wrote here on this third slide, which underlies so many negative and disempowering emotions. Critically relies on a real seeming, but wrongly constricted time frame. This, again, by having the deepest frame of identity right, then you can step back conceptually to where you, in essence, have unlimited time, because you don't know that you don't have unlimited time. So if you don't know that you're helpless, right? If you follow the double negatives and so forth, right? If you don't know that you don't have unlimited time with your as a being, then you may well have unlimited time. And if you are, the odds are in your favor, which they are if you have your deepest frames right, you're inevitably going to win, so you're not helpless. So as you understand what I just referred to there, you always have a place to step back to not feel helpless and to not actually be helpless. Even if a person's really wronged you, and you feel like maybe I need to respond in some major way, or else people will keep walking all over me, or I'll, whatever. But then at the same time, the cost benefit is like, geez, how do I do that, right? Do I go assassinate them? Do I go try to take them to court with our incredibly corrupt and slow system that's basically there to make money for lawyers and justify itself, right? Do you try to take matters into your own hands, but then ironically enough, the police will then attack you, potentially? Do you go to the police and have them basically say, there's nothing we're going to do, that's out of our jurisdiction, or fill out a report, or basically, in most cases, right? Any kind of theft, typically the police just, shrug their shoulders. There's nothing they can do, or nothing that they're going to try to do. But if you try to go after the person yourself, then they can come after you. So there you go. But you can always step back to a time frame and the idea of not struggling, and just be on the lookout for understanding better how to deal with the situation, potentially realizing there's a way to get justice, which is never really your main goal, right? Should be justice, but one way or the other to understand and carry out something that will either get you your property back and or just channel your future resource into something that's going to get you more money anyway, like it's just going to get you more return and or more goodness, or figure out that again, that there is some good, correct way to do something along the lines of justice that will work and be effective and will be a good use of your resources. right? And just giving yourself time and not being in a rush, all of a sudden you don't feel helpless. And understanding might come in time. There might be an opening, something might come up, or you might realize something or whatever. You might, one day run across somebody who's a hitman, and that you trust, right? You can use that, whatever it might be. But the minute you can step back to an unlimited time frame, potentially, you're no longer helpless. And even a long time frame, realizing that you have plenty of life ahead of you. Something simplistic like that is going to work in most cases as well. You don't necessarily need to go all the way to infinite, being, so to speak, right? Infinite time as a being. Just even realizing with a lot of problems that you realistically come up in your life, just being able to step back, to not being in a rush, realizing that the understanding might come, that it might not need to be a priority this moment. Then the helplessness will disappear, because it should disappear. Because again, it's always a constrained time frame, or that the odds are not in your favor. But you genuinely have power to move your world and then other people that you affect towards goodness, right? Understanding leads to progress. You have meta pieces, frames and corners and pieces that are in place that will inevitably lead to that give you power to get towards goodness, to progress towards goodness. Better ideas, more resources that'll lead to goodness, etc. Better decisions, etc. Better representations, and therefore ideas in our mind. Better metaphors. I want to give you a mental image today as well of, like, in part, you can think of your mind as having like a big grab bag of a bunch of metaphors for different concepts, words, people, categories. And as we stop thinking that all those metaphors are already correct and stop trying to prove that they're correct, but instead we work on them constantly, because we realize the value of that. And we realize how much our mind reaches into these metaphors and uses them automatically. It's like garbage in, garbage out, or good stuff in, good stuff out. We're not going to change the fact that our subconscious mind is going to, kind of metaphorically, but it's a useful image, have this grab bag of concepts, metaphors, mental images, constructs. It usefully is going to, again, our subconscious mind, the part of all the processing of our mind that we're not doing on purpose, has to do so much for us. We're not trying to take over the job that our mind does. We're not a mind. We don't do that. Our mind does that. Our mind's terrific, but it has certain bottlenecks that we need to work with it. Right? Our mind is meant to function in concert with us consciously. That involves respecting and valuing what our mind does. Never think I'm implying that our mind is bad and we need to get rid of it so we can be good. We want to respect and appreciate how our mind does so much, and it can only work with what it has. And so gradually we have the constructs, metaphors, definitions of various words, understanding of various important concepts, understanding of critical frames, right? Because like these critical foundational frames play a part in the framing of most everything. But at the same time, they're not like the glory hound in most every case. They're not the thing that's most obvious. And so they're there having this constant ripple effect, but they're also not necessarily front and center, which is how, they get missed and not understood and not valued to think about very much, as opposed to what we're doing here, where we do value and think about. Okay, so that touches on helplessness. All right. So, and I also gave you that grab bag picture, which I think is very helpful. So then what really remains is just to kind of look at this directly, this idea. So in a sense, the most understandable, but the least useful way that our mind does this, but because it's understandable, let's take a moment and look at it, is with our perception of the physical world. Auditorily, tactilely, visually. We have a kind of composite construct of the physical world in general and kind of generally how it works, where a table is solid, right? My table is brown, wood looking color and design or whatever, texture. I think because it's made of wood. That composite multisensory image that I feel, see, that there's at the same time as sensory. Now this blends in with something that starts to become very applicable, which is at the same time, in the same vein as there's our mind's projection of the physical world and construction of the physical world. Along with that, our mind really presents us with a four-dimensional situation, fourth being time, right? And I'm talking about that simplistically, not like some deep physics theory. I think this slide has something like, okay. I wrote here, our mind creates a four-dimensional representation of progress. Oh, progress. So our mind creates kind of a four-dimensional representation of the world. And as a subset of that, does this for progress. Now that part of things is extremely useful to understand what we're talking about here. That your mind does that is important, but I'm talking about now what's useful is understanding what we're talking about. A lot of implication about this topic is going to be radically useful. Because of this whole situation where our mind gives us not just a visual and auditory and tactile representation of the world, but what's kind of fascinating in a way is how our mind creates a feeling of continuity with the past and a projection of what's about to happen in the future, both near term, and it even has a sort of sense of what's going to happen in various mid and maybe long term, right? We may or may not be very much in touch with kind of long-term planning or a sense of what's going to happen depending on the situation, the moment, our personality, right? Our propensity as a person or mind for individuals. But there's some sort of sense that projects out far into the future to some small or not so small degree, some that projects a little bit out to the near term. And definitely for all of us, a kind of fairly immediate sense of the future. I've pointed out that things like I like apples or I don't like apples is a projection about the future because that contains the kind of implicit meaning that you do or don't like apples in the future, in addition to the past and now. So stopping and orienting ourselves to this true sense that our mind creates a kind of four-dimensional sense of the world for us, where there's actually a sense of continuity from the past and a projection to the future that also relates to a sense of causes, right? Our mind is also constantly creating a causal story. I referred to this, I think, 2 webinars ago, the last webinar being a discussion. So the number 7 are definitive, and this is number 8. I believe I covered this, if I have the timeline right. But it's a huge part of the puzzle is to realize that our mind creates a story of cause and then a story of projection into the future. And being able to conceptually step to a frame outside of that, where instead of taking that as reality, we respect that our mind does it. We understand that when our mind does that, there's some accurate overlap and usefulness overlap with what it's doing. I'm not saying that it's doing that all wrong, but it's constructing it, and it's constructing it through heuristics, which is it simplifies questions and the task, because the task is like impossible. reliving the past while you're also experiencing the future is impossible. So our mind has to extract some simplified version of the past, right? And just give us a sense of that in the present in order for us to feel a sense of continuity, right? And then predicting the future is also impossible, but our mind still manages to pretend like it's doing it, and in a way that has a ton of use, right? Or else we'd be more suspicious of the whole situation in the first place, right? Like there's plenty of accuracy, part of that self-fulfilling, and like biased towards, oh yeah, that's what I thought, type of thing, or just seeing what you want to see, right? Whether someone's a good president, a bad president is a little bit subject to interpretation, although it feels very objective, even to me, many times. Okay, so to really, again, as I said, what remains now is just to explain the basic idea of what we're talking about in this webinar. What is it that about our mind creating these creating and using metaphors and representations, and how that's presented to us as truth and reality. So our mind creates this, and when I say our mind creates, God's involved in creating it, and so forth. So one way or the other, it is created, and part of that creation is our mind, and so forth. Part of what's going on is our mind. But simplistically, acknowledging that it's not a perfect statement to say our mind creates it as if it's only our mind, but totally useful as a simplification for the moment. But I can also say we as a being in our consciousness screen, in our ongoing experience of existence, right? We're presented with what feels like the world in the terms of like the physical construct of the world. And even our sense of time continuity, even the fourth dimension feels real. Both that time exists and that we're kind of experiencing, it's like we feel like we're experiencing the present, but if we stop and reflect on what we're experiencing, it's some amount of multiple frames of the present, like through time, because it's like smoothed out for ourselves. Like we feel a flow through time. You can't feel like that if you only experience like a still frame of now with only a sense that the future might happen in the future. We don't really experience that way, right? We experience this sort of continuum. Might I point out that if you imagine a motion picture, I believe basically the same thing happens digitally, but let's just picture it in the old kind of analog way where there were literally on a motion picture, you could see there were literally frames, right? Still frames that are shown like 16 or 30 something frames, whatever the speed is, per second, right? And it would be a projector reel, and it would, REEL, and it would, it spins, right? Whatever on a wheel, talk about, right? And so with a motion picture, again, there's something kind of similar, but that happens, I'm sure, digitally, but easier to picture with the old motion picture. So it's literally a series of still frames, right? Like still pictures, if you look at it on a reel. But they're shown, and our experience of watching the movie on the film, on the slide, whatever, on the movie screen, is that, like, if it's of a car driving down the road, we don't experience a series of still frames of the car moving down the road, each progressed in time by a split second or something, right? We experience a sense of continuous motion. But in the case of a motion picture, it's pretty cool because we can know that there is no motion anywhere. There's only still frames. But then we show those in a certain way, and we totally get the experience of time and motion. So time has to be being fabricated out of nothing, because there's no time. There's just a bunch of still frames shown in sequence. You could say, but they're shown in time, like in real time, they're shown one split second after the other. Yeah, but if you think about what I'm saying, there's no time inherent, to that motion picture, or the time was kind of like taken out, like the same way that you can take the water out of milk and have dried milk and then add the water back in. So it's like there might have been what we think of as a real event that was taken with motion picture taking cameras, right? Where they would take, picture every 1/16 of a second, let's say. And I might have the time frame wrong, but that's not relevant for my illustration. So let's say the motion picture taking camera worked in the following way. It probably does, but I might have some details or facts wrong, but it's not relevant for what I'm saying. So again, you have an actor driving a car as part of a scene down the road, and the camera then takes a picture, which would be a still frame picture, every 1/16 of a second. Then you play that back on your motion picture movie, and it's like your mind adds back in the water of the dried milk, where there was time, so to speak, in people's normal conception of the world, where there's really time. Then it's like there's really time, and then it's taken out, and then it's added back in. But seeing it get taken out and added back in could start to give us a clue, like, wait a second, that means our mind can take something where there is no time, and it adds it in. The perception of it, the experience of it. And to some degree, there has to be a real underlying reality involving the time, because it keeps working, right? Like, we don't run into a problem in a simple day-to-day level of projecting forward, like, okay, I'm going to walk down the street, it's going to take some time, and our mind kind of plays that out. It all kind of happens and works, and the sidewalk is solid, right? And it all, again, works. And so it's presented to us as real, and then it works, and that really reinforces the sense of reality of it all. When it comes to the physical world in day-to-day life, I can't tell you really much use in seeing outside, seeing that this construct that your mind does is actually false. However, as a metaphor, as a stepping stone to understanding when it really does matter big time, like when it comes to causes and projections of the future, when it comes to success and emotions and responses to other people and influencing people and all the kind of stuff that really matters in terms of like planning and bottlenecks and all that, then it's going to be super important. But if you're trying to find the use if you're like, well, where are you going with this, David, in terms of the physical world? Well, I'm not going anywhere except for pointing it out there, because it's kind of easy to see there. But I don't, in a day-to-day level, I don't like walk differently down the street, because I know that my mind's creating this, and it's not really true in a certain sense. The metaphor and representation is totally, the overlap of usefulness is like perfect when I'm walking down the street. Same way that a map could even be theoretically inaccurate in certain ways, but it could be 100% useful in terms of how you need to use it in a particular instance, right? The fact that the map is not New York City might be totally irrelevant for how you need to use a map at a certain point, right? It might be 100% functional, and treating it as if it is New York City might work 100% well for a particular situation or tasks, right? The distinction that New York City is not the map is not New York City, might be wholly irrelevant for getting somewhere. Just like when you watch a movie, it can all feel real when you're watching it, and that can actually be more entertaining, more useful, and never be a problem that the movie kind of feels real, right? So only is kind of a metaphor that helps us understand. Metaphors are great for a person who understands something explaining it to somebody else. So metaphor and therefore for yourself, once you understand something and have a representation, good. A metaphor can be very good. It's just that, so metaphors are not bad, but what's very bad is for metaphors to not be recognized as metaphors, to where you can't possibly think outside of them. That when that takes over, that's when the elephant is the elephant and there's nothing containing it, and your whole existence and life and mind is imprisoned, it's constrained. And that's what we'll see in other people in various ways, and it'll become obvious certain times, and we're like, what the heck, how can they not break out of this? I'm trying to even tell them, and they still can't see it outside of it and break outside of it, because they're experiencing the projection, the representations, the metaphor that their mind makes, the construct of some aspect of reality that to them is reality. So there's no such thing, there's no amount of logic or whatever that can help them unless we first put a crack in their total experience and certainty of a metaphor as reality, as a representation as reality. If you have ambassadors of China and someone thinks that they are China and they can't conceive of anything besides those ambassadors as being China, they pretty much can't even conceive of like the other country. They just like, well, they're China. What are you talking about? Then they need to be able to see outside of that, to have some concept of it first, in order for then what we think of as like logic or our explanation to help them. And then same thing for you and me. We can't break out of various parts of mental prison, even if we're, a lot of us, myself included, probably all of us, have places in life where we still feel like we want to break through, that we feel like we're kind of, our mind is running the show, and we don't want that to be the case. And the critical first step is to realize in that case, we need to apply this meta idea to the specific place where we're feeling and experiencing a metaphor as real and not realizing that we can get outside of it. And it's obvious it might temporarily feel that metaphors are not real, right, and so forth in theory. In reality, there's things for yourself where probably there's places where you feel certain things are real, or they are normal, or they should be a certain way, or the following thing is wrong. Now, it might be the case that something is wrong and you know it and you understand it correctly, but there might be other things where it feels that way based on your mind's total representation. When I say metaphor, we can lump and split here, where our mind creates like a total representation of like a person or an event or now or a project that we're doing, or something that some person did to us, right? That's like a composite construction, all those things I just said, right? Your business, a client, a project for a client, your whole total interaction and fulfillment of something for a client. All of those things can be chunked up and chunked down in the sense that they're comprised of various pieces and smaller metaphors that are put together by your mind based on categories, frames, right, and so forth. So it's like a composite of frames determining metaphors, right? Lacking certain frames or changing a frame, changing one part of a metaphor or one metaphor can change everything, or it can change nothing, right? Just like we can come up with plenty of places in life where you're building a house, right? One part of a house that you're building can change the whole house, destroy the integrity of the whole house, or have no effect, or just kind of be irrelevant. Won't really matter, right? So a change can either be massive, irrelevant, or anywhere in between. When we sometimes experience paradigm shifts or a sense of like everything changed in an instant, that happens sometimes, and then it's fascinating to try to figure out, well, how did that work so that I can do that in certain areas of my life where I want to have change, and I presumably want to, whenever you have a goal or a bottleneck, you want to break it as soon as possible in a sense, right? We don't want to rush, but at the same time, we'd rather have it now rather than later. But that's what I just described is the meta of what's happening, is to change how you feel about something, how healthy you eat, whether you do a certain task that you feel like you're afraid of or putting off or lazy or not motivated about, whether you change your responses, maybe you kind of don't like the way you respond to certain co-workers or your kids or your parents or your love relationship, your partner, once in a while in certain circumstances. Well, your response is based on a composite representation that your mind constructs of that situation. Part of the composite is your metaphor for your partner themselves, if it's a partner, or your child, that metaphor for your child can be broken into parts and pieces. I don't mean smashed. I mean conceptually we can take apart pieces, right? I don't mean broken like broken apart, but it can be broken down mentally into pieces, potentially. So there's various frames, various metaphors that can be looked at as a chunk, chunked down to pieces. But none of this can happen if we just think that some of those things are real. If we're like, well, I know my kid, I know that they're being rebellious right there. That's why I was angry. Well, in that you could write that sentence down and use the words in that sentence as hints for the various pieces, and then you could take like I there you go, identity. No, your meta sense of knowledge and what that means and what leads to knowledge, what your method is for checking knowledge. My kid, I know my kid, right? The sentence was I know my kid, and and they were being rebellious there, and that's why I got angry. My kid, that's also a composite representation, feels true and real. That representation, but it's a mental construct. There's a reality. I'm not saying your child exists. I was talking about like the table, right? In a physical, the table exists in a sense, but the construct that my mind makes, the four-dimensional construct, it's not that it's again when we say, well, is it real? Is that construct of the table? That's like saying, is the map the territory, and or is the map accurate? Which are two different questions, and they're all related. Is my mind making an accurate representation of the table is different than asking if my construct of the table is the table. Is the map the territory? Never. Right? Is the map New York City? Never. But in a certain sense, it is in a metaphorical sense. But once we understand the difference between a metaphor and the reality, of course, right? It's not in another sense. It's not New York City. Is all I mean, right? There's a way there's an obvious way to understand the meaning of New York City and the meaning of a map, so that those are two fundamentally different things. Similarly, whatever the table really is, and my mind's construct of a table that feels so real, right? In a sense, it's neither real nor perfect, nor accurate. In another sense, it's pretty accurate, right? It's quite accurate, and it's fully accurate in the sense of functionality, right? Like I can't improve my life at all, really, that I know of, by getting deep about the table, except as an example, except as something that helps me to understand the deeper concept, because it's very applicable other places. However, when our mind comes up with what's the cause of stuff, right? I talked about this where it overascribes agency, it underascribes luck. Let's think about luck for a second. Luck for any individual, for you, is exactly correlated and related to your lack of knowledge, your lack of total omniscience about that situation. So if you're doing a project, or if you're judging what another person's going to do in the future, or how you're going to feel in the future, or whether you're going to succeed at something, whether you're going to solve some problem in a certain time frame, then whatever you don't fully have knowledge of, down to the tiniest detail, then relative to you, there's some luck involved, right? Wherever your knowledge, real actual knowledge ends, luck begins for you, right? Luck is not some force that exists in and of itself that does stuff, of course, right? Luck, chance, that stuff can't do anything. But it's critical to understand that for you, everything's luck outside of what you actually know. And I've talked about before, in terms of what you choose to believe about the future, as soon as you hit the limits of your knowledge, you can just kind of believe whatever is most useful, and should, right? By logic, if you think it through. However, the more of what you can know that you build, that you do know, the better. the more relevant, impactful knowledge that you have, right? Knowledge, like reading the National Enquirer in more detail, isn't necessarily going to help you achieve anything, right? So it's not just like inquiring minds want to know. I'm not denigrating the National Enquirer, I'm just using that to illustrate a point. But anything that furthers you, what's going to end up furthering your mental representations, your constructs, your metaphors, your representations that are relevant for breaking a particular bottleneck, that's gaining real understanding. Your mind, there's a major false path when it comes to understanding that's critical that I wanted to get across in this webinar too, as we start to get close to the time limit here in 10 minutes or so. What am I saying here? Frames. Shoot. So our metaphors. Oh wait, thinking that things can be. I talked about how a big. So understanding. The fundamental paradigm that's going to make you successful and happy is to the more we understand this statement, and especially the understanding part of this statement, this is kind of everything. Understanding is progress. I want to talk about what's in this next sentence, but I need to say something else first. Therefore, the bottleneck that's going to kind of really can get you is if you get a false, premature is a great word, feeling and sense of understanding. Without realizing it. And then that kind of becomes what you want. That's the real danger. That's like, once you overcome this, once you kind of break this false path, then there's really clear sailing. Because really, again, all you need is this one idea, this understanding line idea. Understanding line meaning like an arrow going toward the right, and the right being progress. That understanding is how you want to feel and measure progress. But because people think they want to feel progress, they then want a shortcut. The mind wants to add, like, kind of substitute an easier thing for understanding, and that is to come up with a metaphor that just feels pat. And so there's like feels right, that, and how can a metaphor feel good and coherent and like it fits, like it checks out, like, yeah, this is my kid. I could picture, feel like there's a representation people have. They don't realize, again, people don't feel that their metaphors and projections and representations their mind makes, they don't experience them as metaphors and projections and representations. They experience them as is, as reality, as knowing, right? Like as in the phrase, I know my kid, I know myself, I know whatever, right? So just the sentence or thought or crack in the wall where you can see that as a construct or a metaphor that might have all kinds of useful overlap with your actual child, but it's a construct and it's a metaphor. Just that crack is enough if you go to Vegas and keep placing bets on it, so to speak. If you act on it, like if you start to use it, you're now playing with a stacked deck in life. And that crack will get wider and wider. The whole ripple effect is where you won't need to prove without realizing it. Your mind won't keep needing to prove that its metaphors are right. See, our mind creates this projection and representations, and then it's like it wants to prove that they're right. And so it'll blind you to contrary thoughts any potential cracks or anything, it'll marginalize, delete, and so forth. Once we have a crack in that whole process, again, now we're playing with a stacked deck in our favor, and over time, everything's going to get better and better. So what our mind does in the sentence that I wrote here, I focused before on the four-dimensional part, but now let's focus on the rest of the sentence, which is critical. So let's not get bogged down in the four-dimensional. The four-dimensional is relevant, but we want to take the sentence as a whole. Instead, I just kind of focus on that. Your mind creates a composite representation for any situation where you want something, have a goal, whatever. You have a project, you're trying to create something, make a website, perform a service, hit a certain income goal, make money, have a person approve of you, have a love relationship long-term, whatever. Have someone have sex with you, whatever you're trying to achieve. Have fun that day. Feel a sense of accomplishment at the end of the day. All these things, our mind creates a kind of a composite representation of the world and how that goal fits in it. And your mind then makes you feel, and therefore it calculates that getting closer to that goal. Or if you're like building a house, it's not like you're getting closer to the house, but the house is getting closer to completion, right? Building a website, getting closer to completion. So you're getting closer in time by something getting more completed, or you're getting closer to your income goal with numbers, right? But there's this total representation of the situation, and your mind then, what a goal is your mind wants to get closer to that. And if as part of that representation, things come up where you feel helpless, then something, boredom, anger, frustration, depending on the details, disempowerment, a feeling of lack of motivation, because the more helpless you feel, often the less you'll feel like you have an impact, right? And so therefore taking action feels like it has less bang for its buck, right? Which will lead to a lack of motivation. So all of these things, it's a whole new ball game if we see it all as a representation. And what understanding is understanding how, both meta how and then the specifics of getting the pieces, the parts of our metaphors and our representations, the parts of our composite of that thing, of that whole composite relating to any particular goal, let's say, any event, right? Whatever, your life as a whole. Getting pieces of that representation more accurate. Until the bottleneck is broken, the goal is achieved. So you just get your representation, you just work on your representations. That can very often can and should involve taking action. If I want to get to a certain income goal, I might need to call people up that could become my client that I don't know, but they're good prospects from some way that I got them, or they're potentially decent prospects, whatever. By actually going and making calls, that will help me get my representation more accurate of what's going to happen, what objections can come up, and so forth. Now, if I start making calls and I fall flat on my face, like I don't get the result I want, when people have an incorrect meta sense of the whole thing, then they'll also be learning that it's not working. But if you can, it's pretty obvious if we step back from it that we want a situation in life in every way where, if for example it involves making calls, that we can make calls and learn from those calls and get better without learning that it's not working. Of course it's not working until it works, right? Now we could also enroll in Michael and Eric's awesome sales machine, right, and sales domination courses. And they're like really good at working on this. They have great stuff for that, right? So that I didn't do that as a plug. My point is that's an obvious additional type of thing that can lead to better representation. Or we could sign up for some other sales course that may or may not help us, but it might. And we need to know what we can know, and then use our best judgment in our limited resources to, we might give a go at some other sales course if we don't know about that one, or that one didn't exist, or for some reason we wanted additional training and so forth. Whatever, it's all reasonable, but we all want to do it within this total frame and meta understanding of, we're just getting better at asking better questions, having a better representation of what's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that we're having these hardened metaphors, right? So if I call people up and get a certain type of response 3 or even 10 or 50 times in a row, then what people can do is that can harden into a metaphor of, this is what happens when you call somebody. And yet it's also weirdly true that if Eric Brief calls somebody, he might get a totally different situation. So even though you've had something happen 50 times, that metaphor that you have, that construct that your mind creates of, this is what happens when I make a call, it feels real, and it feels like it's based on direct experience and reality, but it's not real in a certain sense. It's real in one sense, right? Your memories might be, and the composite might be relatively accurate depiction of the kind of average type of thing that happens. But it's not what needs to happen necessarily in the future. There's things you're still blind to. And this is with all of us, right? And so we try to find ways to spot what we're blind to. But when you know that your metaphors aren't accurate enough or useful enough in your representations, the pieces your minds are using, you don't know where the piece might be off necessarily, or where the improvement might be. But if you understand the meta process of all you need to do and all you can do, anything else is just an illusion of doing something more or better or working harder. The only thing that you're doing that's effective anyway is this. All the rest of it just is like, it looks like it's what's doing it, but this is what's doing it anyway. This is what's making real progress. This is what's getting you actually closer to your goal. And when you understand it properly, it can't be stopped. The deck is stacked in your favor. The winning is basically inevitable as long as it's possible in the first place. And if it's not, you're going to win anyway, because you'll come to, as your metaphors and your representations get better, more useful, you'll realize that the thing that was impossible is obviously not where you're going to get good bang for your buck, and so you'll do something somewhat different, right? There might be the overall same bottleneck you're trying to break, but you'll have a different approach, because one approach is a dead end, and you'll realize that at some point as as things get more accurate. So we don't want to buy into this deep idea that seems like the only reality of our mind creates this composite for our goals, and we want to get closer, and we feel good, or we feel like a thing or person is good if they're helping us advance toward our goals or bring our goal closer to us, or to the present, to happening. That whole thing, that whole conception that involves goodness and progress, it's wrong. We don't want to buy into it anymore. We want to buy, there's a total paradigm shift that involves various parts, right, that I'm talking about, this whole definitive series, right? Because again, there's really one composite idea that involves you fully integrating into your life, understanding, and only understanding as progress. That does not preclude, it actually encourages taking action. So it's not like you're just sitting in your chair not doing stuff. You can take massive action, but fundamentally what's going on is understanding as progress. You'll feel more empowered, more motivated, more of a sense of inevitable success, which is empowering, the more you integrate this anyway. So it's all positive. You'll achieve success faster, but without rush, more inevitably, better, consistently, more easily, more effortless, if we understand effort to be mental conflict in our own mind, right? There might be a lot of moving your body. I don't mean there's less effort that way. But moving our body's fine. As a matter of fact, again, it takes mental effort and conflict to stay still. If you're trying to stay totally still and stare at the wall all day, that would be terrible, right? So there's nothing inherently bad at all about doing stuff, if it ever feels like that. Of course, it often doesn't feel that way in the first place. But to the extent that we confuse hard work with a bunch of motion, that's nonsense. It's more, if we look at the other extreme, it would be terrible and unpleasant effort to just stay still and do nothing all day and stare at the wall, right? So the idea is here, hard work is kind of irrelevant to the equation. In some cases, it's exactly moving your body a lot is exactly what's needed. In other cases, it's not. It's just kind of not correlated one way or the other, positively or negatively, with success. What is the understanding. In particular instances, it is. So regarding your situation with a particular goal, it might be totally necessary and therefore correlated to do a lot of physical motion. I'm just saying that overall, depending on the goal, with everyone taking everyone into account and all the different goals that they're going to go for, bottlenecks they're going to try to break, in some cases, a bunch of bodily hard work is necessary. In some cases, it's not. In some cases, a bunch of kind of effortful thinking is necessary. In other cases, it won't be. But what will always lead you to the happiest and most effective experience, including not totally failing, or being, people can fail by being imprisoned in a certain mental construct that won't allow them to reach their goal, right? They might not reach a moment when they feel like they failed, but they're running in circles inside of an area where their goal can't be reached, right? That's very common. But it's just pure greatness and awesomeness and goodness, and everything in life then, like, that's good, flows. Money, sex, and all the rest of it flows from this understanding is progress. And then what we're doing here in Definitive Series and everything I talk about really is just increasing our accurate representation of the bits of the pieces that go into that and the frames and everything. All right, excellent. I like how that came together. Not saying it's perfect by any stretch, but I like how it came together given doing my best here. So there we go. I think we can pretty much end the webinar here. And I appreciate you guys very much. Great attendance again. And if you're on YouTube, then you can always like it, comment. There's a guy that I like, Marbazier, who plays Civ 6 and other games. He has a funny thing where he says, as is tradition, you can denounce the algorithm, but by making a comment denouncing the YouTube algorithm. But that's still a comment, which helps with engagement, and so forth. So it's kind of a great idea that he has. Regardless, thanks everybody, and I will talk to you soon. Oh, so I think next webinar will be in 2 weeks. I kind of got lucky. Didn't even do this intentionally, but I kind of straddled the Super Bowl in a good way. Super Bowl's next week. The week after that, I will. I think I'll go straight for the proof of God, and then I'll just look at doing kind of various specific topic, kind of bonus or not, it's kind of irrelevant, but kind of topics. So it'd be kind of like a 10-part series with various kind of bonus topics that I'll talk about. You're very welcome, Julie. This webinar was very important. What we covered was very important. It might be a multiple watch type of thing, but in a sense, it's familiar. In a sense, it's some stuff. There's things I said and that I realized for this webinar that I hadn't realized before. So if you feel like you've heard it all before, then watch it carefully, because I feel like I understand things a little bit further than before on the way up to this webinar. No, it's different. Okay, great. Yes, you got that sense that I've kind of progressed the narrative, so to speak, and everything. So good. You're very welcome. Yeah, I'm pretty excited. What we covered here is pretty. Oh, I said 10, and then this is 8, and then that would be 9 if I did the proof of God. So anyway, maybe 9, maybe not. We'll see how it all goes. Same and different as usual. Great, excellent. Yeah, of course. I'm always, as I admittedly, trying to just communicate this one idea of understanding as progress, in a sense. But then there's lots of important pieces, including that I don't know, I discovered them myself. I've been working on this for years, discovering more pieces myself, more understanding of it. Okay, guys, awesome. Looking forward. You've broken my mind now. Great work. Excellent. That's perfect. That's what we want. And maybe this is even, this webinar is worth a discussion about it. Maybe I'll do the proof of God, and then I'll even maybe do a final, the 10th definitive series might be a discussion where that's kind of officially part of the series, where we kind of delve into this exact topic of the representations more, because it can be a topic for many hours or whatever. Not that the discussion will be many hours. It'll be probably the usual hour and a half. Excellent, Brett. Great. And again, that's basically understanding the the pieces with cause, goodness, and infinite. Okay, excellent, guys. I will see you in 2 weeks, and it'll be wonderful. Slight possibility something will come up where I can't do it in 2 weeks, but likely 2 weeks. Take care all, and I appreciate you.